I don't want to talk about my personal history too much anymore. Let me plunge right into the issue. So you guys gave the land acknowledgement of the indigenous people in Canada. So it's not controversial that the establishment of Canada was a colonial project. People came from Europe and they displaced violently and often brutally, but certainly consistently, the indigenous population, and they subjected them to severe suffering. I have here one of my favorite possessions. I was given it 3 months ago in Haida Gwaii, where I gave a trauma workshop for Haida people, and the stories of what happened to these people in and outside the residential schools are truly horrendous. What is also true that there was a poll in Canada 3 years ago where 70% of Canadians said that they knew nothing or little about the residential schools. So it just tends to be the case that the Indigenous story, the Indigenous narrative, is not told in colonizing countries. Even in Canada, where the colonizing project is for the most part complete. So as a Zionist, I used to believe in that particular narrative, and that narrative can be summed up very simply. The Jewish people were exiled from their ancient homeland during Roman times, something like 2,000 years ago. They've wandered in this diaspora or exile ever since, subjected to all manner of persecution, anti-Semitism, massacres, discrimination. And then there was a resurgence of that anti-Semitic impetus, especially in Eastern Europe, but not only in Eastern Europe, in the late 19th century, as a result of which a movement arose with the idea that we should have a Jewish homeland in the ancient precinct where we came from. And thus was born the Zionist movement, which was established with great sacrifice and endeavor. And then in 1947, the United Nations voted to divide the land between two peoples, the local Palestinians and the Jewish immigrants. The Arabs did not accept this, the Jews did. The Arabs attacked Israel. Israel happened to win. They captured more territory, which they held on to. And the Arabs fled because their leaders told them to flee so that they can have free hand to defeat the Jews, after which they were supposed to come back. Ever since then, Israel has wanted peace, but the Arabs have never recognized its right to exist, have launched a number of wars against it, 1967, 1973, most recently Hamas on October the 7th, and so that no peace has been possible. That's by and large the narrative that I used to subscribe to. But it's ahistorical. And I'm not going to quote you any Palestinian sources, although I could. I'm just going to quote you Jewish sources. And in the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s, but culminating in the 90s, there was a whole group of Israeli historians that actually researched what happened here. So what I'll be doing is giving you a Jewish but non-Zionist perspective. So first of all, it's perfectly true that the impetus for the Zionist project was anti-Semitism, and in that sense, it was a trauma response. And there was horrific trauma in Eastern Europe in late 19th, earliest 20th centuries, mass killings of Jews, terrific discrimination, all of which, of course, culminated in the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis, largely during the Second World War. That's true. So the first impetus is a trauma impetus and a justifiable desire for refuge. That's the first point. The second point, however, is that this could not have been established without a colonial project. When I say colonial, because there was already people occupying, living, and having lived there for hundreds and thousands of years in what is called Palestine. So that the only way that the project of a exclusively Jewish state or a predominantly Jewish state could be established, but was through the oppression and displacement of the local population. That's a colonial project. Let me quote you David Ben-Gurion, who later became the first prime minister of Israel, leader of the labor Zionist movement. And he said in 1938 that the conflict with the Arabs is in its essence a political one, and politically we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. And he said we call them terrorists, but they're just defending their land, just as we would in their place. So said David Ben-Gurion. Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was the founder of the revisionist Zionist wing of the Zionist movement, which became Herut and later became the Likud, the current government, said the following: Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed force. So these early Zionists and these founders of Israel never had any illusions. They knew what they were up against. They were up against the local people who did not want to be displaced. In 1920, the leader of the Zionist Commission, Dr. Ader, said that our aim is to make Palestine as Jewish as in as short time as possible, as Jewish as England is English and America is American. Now, when he said this, there were 100,000 Jews living in Palestine, mostly recent immigrants, and about 700,000 Arabs, mostly indigenous people. So it had to be a colonizing project, and they recognized that. So the first stream then is Jewish trauma. The second stream is this colonizing impetus, which had to be the way they did it. The third stream was British imperialism, because that minority of immigrants coming into a land already populated could not have achieved its purposes without imperial support. And so the Balfour Declaration declaring that the British in favor of a Jewish entity in Palestine, Winston Churchill, that great Democrat, as the Indians and the Africans know so well, he said that the establishment of a Jewish entity in Palestine accords with the best interests of the British Empire. So with British imperial support in the 1920s and 30s, Jewish institutions were built up. Jewish army was organized and trained by the British. Jewish political organizations were allowed to thrive. The structure of a state was allowed to develop. Meanwhile, local Palestinian opposition was brutally suppressed by the British, with the usual methods of murder, killing, torture, jailings, exile, as any indigenous movement can tell you under British rule. Then comes the terrific genocide in Europe in the 1940s, and then the United Nations. And by the way, who were the United Nations? On the one hand, it was Soviet Russia and its communist dictatorship clients in Eastern Europe. On the other hand, the United States and its brutal dictatorship clients in South America. And these Democrats all decided to divide Palestine in such a way that a majority of the land will go to the minority of Jews, mostly recent immigrants, and that the land was divided in such a way that hundreds of thousands of Arabs would have to live under Jewish rule, whereas very few Jews would have to live under Palestinian rule. Now, it's not true that Israel accepted this. Israel didn't accept anything. They just said that we will declare our state. They never said we accept a Palestinian state, because they never wanted a Palestinian state. Because the Zionist project from the beginning was all of Palestine for Jews. And if you look at the charter of the Likud party, we keep talking about the Hamas charter. If you look at the Likud charter, it says no non-Jewish entity east of the Jordan River. That's what the ruling party of Israel considers its constitution. In 1967, after that war, I researched the war. I was 23 at the time, still partly a Zionist. And I wrote an article which said that Israel started this war quite deliberately, which it did, with the aim of occupying territories which it'll never give back. I don't think I was too far from wrong. I cannot go into all the history since then. Who started which war and what are the back and forth? I mean, there's a lot of history there. All I'm saying is that there's a whole other narrative established by Israeli historians. Now, let me now quote you about what happened in 1948. This is Benny Morris, who's an Israeli and a Zionist, and he writes about 1948. What the new material shows is that there were far more Israeli acts of massacre than I had previously thought. The Israeli Defense Forces were given operational orders that stated explicitly that they were to uproot the villagers, expel them, and destroy the villages themselves. This started before the declaration of the state and before the counterattack by the Arab armies. There were, according to Benny Morris, and he's not the only Jewish historian, there were at least 24 acts of massacre of Palestinians by the Jewish forces in 1948, and multiple cases of rape that he's documented, which is only the tip of the iceberg, as he points out, because most of those cases were not reported. So let's just put October the 7th into some kind of context. The largest case of massacre occurred in Deir Yassin, 100 and 110 people, Lod, 250 people, hundreds of people in Daima, and so on and so forth. That's what happened in 1948. And there's the deliberate expulsion of the Palestinians with the destruction, utter destruction of 450 Palestinian villages. Their houses were either occupied by Jews or bulldozed over. Their gravestones were bulldozed over. And you can travel through Israel, as I have, and never know that Palestinians used to live there, just as you can travel through Eastern Europe and never know that Jews used to live there. And again, most people are not aware of this history because the history of the colonized people is never told to the colonizing population. Now, then in 1967, there was that war. And since then, there's been a project of colonizing what remains of Palestine. So in the ensuing years, since 1967, and mostly since the Oslo Accords, hundreds of thousands of Jews have moved into the occupied territories, which is illegal according to international law. You cannot transfer your population into an occupied territory, number one. In how that occupation is achieved is brutal. That population has no right to vote, no right to have any choice in their destiny, no right to run their economy. Their children are jailed and tortured. In the recent exchanges with Hamas of hostages, most of the Palestinians released were between the ages of 14 and 17. Children who are jailed because they may put up an anti-Israeli poster, which is the right of an occupied people to do, or post something online. The torture of Palestinian prisoners has been well documented by Amnesty International, by an organization called Israeli Physicians for Human Rights. But the point is that at this point, there's about 700,000 settlers, illegal ones, who have rights that the Palestinians don't. I, as a Jew, now get this, I, as a Jew, could travel to Israel tomorrow, land at Ben Gurion Airport, which is located in Lod, which is where hundreds of Palestinians were massacred and from where they were expelled. And by the way, Benny Morris, the historian who I'm quoting, is a Zionist. He's not in favor of the massacres, and he doesn't justify the rapes. Give him his due. But he says that the expulsion of Palestinians was absolutely necessary, and without that, we could not have built our state. He thinks it was a good thing. He thinks they didn't expel enough Palestinians. So I could land at that airport tomorrow, and as a Jew, claim the right of citizenship. And by the next day, I could move to the West Bank, where I could be given a home and water rights, which would entitle me 6 times as much water annually as the indigenous Palestinian population per capita. You can collect money in Canada for the Jewish National Fund, whose exclusive mandate is to buy land in Israel for Jews only. And in Canada, this is a tax-deductible expense. Imagine if there was a fund in Canada where you could buy land for Christians only, and that would be a tax-deductible charity. Now, I'll finish with one more thing. I've given you enough. No, well, no. I mean, I could go on for another 3 hours. You can ask me later. This idea of the Israelis left Gaza, it wasn't occupied. Yes, it was. They just moved the bars of the concentration camp outside the camp. But movement of goods, medicine, food, totally controlled by Israel. The Palestinians are not allowed to fish in their own water. And when they protested peacefully in 2018, 2019, they call it, by the way, who are the Gazans? People who can look across the barbed wire and look at the fields that their parents used to till and cultivate. And in 2005, there was a study done in international trauma, war trauma response. The most traumatized children anywhere in the world were in Gaza in 2005. Guess who you think those young men were who streamed to Israel on October the 7th? Not justifying that atrocity, which was an atrocity, but who were those kids and what had happened to them? What happened to them is that in 2019 and 2018, they had a peaceful protest called the March of Return, where they would march up to the barbed wire and demand the right to return to their homeland, which is the right of any expelled people, any group of refugees. If I have the right to return there after 2,000 years, and I can't prove that I was there 2,000 years ago, but let's assume I was. If I have the right to return after 2,000 years, and they don't have the right to return after 80 years, what are we talking about here? They had these peaceful marches. The Israel army, as exposed by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the snipers ran contests as to how many kneecaps they could shatter sitting atop their tanks and their armed vehicles. So they were massacred. 200 of them were killed in peaceful protests, including medical people wearing medical uniforms. So that's what's been going on in Gaza. In the occupied territories, again, I've already talked about it briefly. I just finished with one comment: anti-Semitism. Is it anti-Semitic to criticize Israel? Well, according to the Zionist ideology, it is, because Judaism and Jewishness is expressed through Zionism. So anybody who criticizes Zionism is by definition an anti-Semite. The only thing that forgets is that throughout Zionist history, and including today, there are many Jews who want nothing to do with it, who are critical of that state and what it does. And so there's this campaign to intimidate well-meaning non-Jews. Because if you criticize Israel, you're an anti-Semite. No, you're not. There's plenty of Israelis who are critical of their state. And certainly hundreds of Jews internationally are getting arrested these days protesting the current atrocities. Don't be intimidated by this charge of anti-Semitism. It's nonsense. It's intellectual terrorism is what it is. I'll stop here, Prakash. I could go on for much longer.
Yeah, I know, Gabor. Thank you so much for setting the context for our discussion. And if this works on your last point about anti-Semitism, I want to see if if this works. I'm trying to play a very short video, if I may, if I can get it. Let's see if I can share it. Give me one sec. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Sorry?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
There's just no audio. Prakash, there's no audio.
Oh, there's no audio? Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Let me see again. Oh, sorry. Got it.
It is not the difference of religions which is causing this conflict. The state of Israel does not represent all Jews and certainly does not represent the Jewish religion. According to Jewish religion, all of this is criminal. All of this is forbidden. Basics of Jewish belief teaches that Jews are in a divinely decreed exile. We are even forbidden to create a sovereignty for ourselves. But especially when this is by killing, stealing, oppressing an entire people. This is not only criminal according to international law. This is a true violation of Judaism. And still, those people who choose not to follow Judaism misuse that very same religion to justify all those crimes forbidden in Judaism. The root cause is this criminal occupation which is oppressing an entire people. We have to end this occupation in its entirety. If people will ask me my advice, the leaders of Israel should wake up tomorrow morning and step out of the Knesset and return the land back to indigenous population. I guarantee peace.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabor. And oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that. Next speaker we have is Francesca. Sorry about that. Francesca Albanese. We are so grateful that you could join us and share with us some of your experience. She is, of course, the special rapporteur for Palestine, and we are so fortunate to have you to share, firstly, your experience on the ground, and touching on some of the international humanitarian laws and so forth. So I will give you the floor, the virtual floor, and you can also have about 15 minutes, give or take. And if need be, I will prompt you with some questions. But I think it'll be a good idea for us to follow up with you, since Gabor had set this stage for us.
You're just muted, Francesca.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. So hello, everyone. And I would like also to thank the organizers and the fellow panelists. I wish as well we were brought together under different circumstances. And as it was said before, this is probably by Dr. Maté, this is probably the most difficult phase of my life and my professional life, because I've never seen that much horror happening in my remit. I mean, yes, I'm the special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, and I mean, I've seen violence.
I think it's just a lag. Francesca, I don't know if you can hear us, but if you want to turn off your camera, that might help with the stream.
She seems to be frozen.
Yeah. Well, we've just lost her.
I'm sure she just logged off and trying to log in again.
Yeah. In the meantime, why don't I'm going to ask a question to Gabor, because you know, as the trauma expert, we've heard a lot of concerns from, and this is one of the reasons we established this panel, people feeling a sense of deep isolation, unable to speak out in solidarity with Palestinians, being called out, excluded within their workplaces or any organization they're a part of. And it's very traumatic, especially when we see the images on TV of people losing their lives. I was wondering if you can offer some advice on how to deal with the trauma that is impacting many communities, even though those that are not directly impacted by the conflict.
Okay, well, to be fair about it, the stress and the trauma goes all ways. Certainly for Jews who have grown up inside the narrative that we're always the victims and they don't know the Palestinian history at all, October the 7th would have just seemed like another anti-Semitic atrocity where people are being killed because they're Jews. And this is how it's interpreted in the Jewish communities often. And then the world responds to the horrors that they see in Gaza with rage and dismay. And then many Jews just seeing that as an attack on them. So I don't legitimize the narrative inside which that happens, but emotionally, that's how they're experiencing it. No, the reality is, of course, is that it's perfectly legal and it's okay in this country to support the killing of 20,000 Palestinian civilians, including 7,000, 8,000 children. That's really okay. But if you speak out and you call that genocide, or if you say something like Palestine has the right to be free from the river to the sea, then you're accused of being an anti-Semite and you might lose your job. And I know people who've lost their jobs. I myself had a speaking invitation at a major Canadian university canceled. The discussion wasn't going to be about Palestine or Israel. It was going to be about my usual subject of trauma, but they canceled it. I can handle it. My job, my work, my livelihood doesn't depend on it, but some people's do. And while it's perfectly okay to speak on behalf of the killing of 20,000 civilians, it's not okay to speak out against it. And Palestinian students on campuses are having a really hard time. And people are intimidated. Academics who speak out, they come under censure, which adds to the level of trauma, because not only is it just traumatic for so many people to watch what's going on, as Francesca said, it's unprecedented, this kind of horror. And what's also unprecedented is that this horror is justified and validated and rationalized. So not only is that traumatic for a lot of people, they also come under personal threat should they speak out against it. And that's the state of free speech in this country, Canada.
Thank you. Thank you. We can see you, Francesca. Welcome back. I hope it's better this time. Please go ahead.
Hopefully. So can you hear me well? I suppose so. So I was saying, yeah, it's been horrific. I know that the situation before the 7th of October was particularly pleasant, but so I would like to make three sets of remarks, also building on what Gabor has said. And the first is the pre-7th of October, really taking from where we left in a way. and then the post 7th of October, and then the structural violence that accompanies the question of Palestine, with basic facts. Palestinians are killed, they're blamed, they're smeared, they're silent, and many with them only for daring to speak truth, or to ask for justice, to ask for the application of international law. So I've been, starting with the first point, I've been a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory for 16 months before the 7th of October. And I had been extremely alarmed by the level of violence. That again, it was not completely different in type, in nature, from what my predecessors, Professor Michael Link, is Canadian by the way, and his predecessors, Professor Richard Falk and Professor Dugard had reported. All of us together for 20 years have denounced the apartheid regime, the settler colonial nature of Israel's occupation, and the various illegal practices that accompany it. And still, as of May last year, there has been a skyrocketing of violence. Now, I have to say that the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory is structural, because as of 1967, without taking into account what Gabor has already said, I mean, the overall creation of the State of Israel justified for the Jewish people as it could. In any case, we have to recognize entailed huge trauma, a pattern of destruction, dismemberment of a nation, violence and human rights violations, and forced displacement. Ethnic cleansing has been a constitutive element of Palestinian collective life as of 1947, meaning even before the creation of the State of Israel, because forced displacement had started before. But even without going that back, as of 1967, Israel has occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And as of then, it has violated international law, because as of then, it has started to establish colonies, which are a war crime under international law, which are, and they violate the only provision which is almost explicit in prohibiting settler colonialism, which is Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which on the one hand prohibits the transfer of occupying powers population into the occupying territory, but also in the same provision prohibits the forced displacement of the inhabitant, which is what Israel has done from the very beginning, and particularly as of 1967 as an occupying power. So the occupation has been tainted from the very beginning. But also, what's the reason to maintain, as Professor Michael Link has pointed out in one of his early reports, what's the reason to maintain an occupation which should be temporary and should be maintained for military necessities? Here, there is no military necessity. Israel has maintained the military occupation, which then means that it has maintained 5 million Palestinians today under martial law, military rule, and the existence of the Palestinian authorities, de jure or de facto, have not altered this basic fact that the Palestinian, for the Palestinians, Israel has always presented itself as, to quote Israeli journalist Amira As, as a military junta, as a military dictatorship, because the Palestinians for 56 years have been under military orders written by soldiers and forced by soldiers who consider the Palestinian population, who should be protected under international law, hostile. And then, of course, adjudicated in military tribunals by Israeli soldiers. Voila, this is the reality that Israel has enforced for 56 years. And the Oslo agreements have been the Oslo Accords have been a huge distraction, because they've given the sense that there was a state in theory, a status in the making. But no, I mean, after 30 years, the Palestinian Authority has municipal autonomy at best. This is what is the state of Palestine. a collection of municipalities. Is it a state? I'm sorry, no, it's a state born in captivity whose prospective citizens, who are not even citizens, they are under the rule of the occupier. And so this has meant structural violence, because confiscating the land and displacing people who live in there, who have their orchards there, who have their sense of belonging there, on top of the refugees who had been displaced in 1948. This is violent, and this violence is structural. And on top of it, there has been the eruptive violence of the settlers and the armed soldiers committing crimes through and through, committing arbitrary, carrying out arbitrary arrests, summary executions, including of children, and forcibly displaced by also demolishing the structures where Palestinians would live. Just to tell you, in the last 20 years, as of 2007, 2008, 6,000 Palestinians had been killed, most of them in Gaza. And this is to those who think that the reality of violence started on the 7th of October. 4,000 Palestinians had been killed in 5 prior wars, in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022, and 300 of them during the March of Return, when the Palestinians were protesting at the border against the siege, because those in Gaza had been under siege for 16 years, which was in itself a destructive measure, a war crime, a collective punishment. And, you know, since 2005, 13,000 children have, as young as 12, sometimes even younger, but as young as 12 on average, have been arrested and detained, often in the middle of the night. And the Palestinians today say, what's the difference between Israeli hostages and our kids when they are taken without charge, without arrest warrant, in the middle of the night, brutalized and tortured? So the reality is blinding in its cruelty. It was brutal already before the 7th of October. And as of the 7th of October, of course, without justifying, without downplaying, without condoning the horrific crimes that Hamas has committed, because it's out of question that attacks against civilians are always to be condemned. But we cannot see that attack. It's shocking, but not surprising, because all of us knew that sooner or later the situation would explode. And the thing is that whatever Israel has done as of the 7th of October is pure vengeance, because Israel has invoked a right of self-defense under international law that doesn't have. Yes, it's true, Israel has the right to protect itself, its citizens, and its territory, but it doesn't have the right to wage a war against the population it maintains under occupation. And how can we justify? I mean, after over 2 months now, Israel has killed, for sure, almost 19 people. 9,000 of them are children, and 8,000 people are missing. But the overall context, this is not a war to uproot Hamas. This is not a war to eradicate Hamas. This is not even a war to weaken Hamas, because look at what has happened. Where are the casualties? Not in combat. The casualties are by heavily bombing of residential areas, mosques, church, schools, hospitals. The entire infrastructure is destroyed for years to come. 60% of the civilian infrastructure is gone. Hospitals, which are sacred, the most sacred, especially at times of war, because these structures have to supply, have to provide assistance to those injured. And now there are over 50,000 injured that don't even know where to go. 1,900,000, almost the 90% of the population in Gaza is in the street. They don't even have a home anymore. They are either camped in UNRWA refugee camps or in apartments. There is one shower for 700 people, and basically no toilets. I mean, what has happened to the people in Gaza is beyond imagination. I've never seen such a level of cruelty and barbarity. So let's go to the last point. So, and then again, there would be obligations because many of us have denounced that this could be a genocide, as if there is a severe risk of genocide. This could be a genocide in the making. We have said it out loud because there is an obligation to prevent genocide under international law. And this was also the product of the sacrifice of millions of Jewish people. I mean, the Genocide Convention was written thanks to the contribution of Jewish scholars. So today, the reality is that the international community, because of the usual hypocrisy and political convenience, has been unable to put an end to this. And the reality is that we are still counting the death, both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas military presence, and still 300 people have been killed in 2 months, 70 children, Jenin, Balata, many refugee camps have been bombed, 20 communities have packed and gone, they've left, they've been forcibly displaced, as it happened in 1947, 49, and in 1967, out of settler violence, because there are armed settlers committing violence through and through. So in the face of this situation, I go back to the first point. Palestinians are killed, Palestinians are blamed, because again, no one discusses the context, the pre-7th of October. It's all Hamas's fault. And again, without excusing Hamas, how can we forget what the Palestinians have endured, which has produced Hamas, by the way? Because the tradition of the political life of the Palestinians was secular. They were the most secular political force in the entire Middle East. And still, all this is a product and is a byproduct of the longest and most violent military occupation of modern history. And again, as I said, killed, blamed, smeared, and silenced. Absolutely. Today, as Gabor said, it's impossible to speak out without being accused of supporting terrorism and being an anti-Semite. I know something about that, and my predecessors with me. Doesn't matter that then those who defend me are not only Palestinians, not only people of consciousness, scholars, Jewish scholars. Doesn't matter. The narrative goes on and on with the complicity, particularly of people in the West. Why so? I keep on explaining this to myself, like the settler colonial logic, the settler colonial mentality, which is upheld by racism. As Omar Barghouti said in a conference we were recently part of, we Western people have still 500 years of colonialism as part of our DNA. We cannot get rid of it that easily. And this is the reality that we face today. A genocide unfolding and the international community completely paralyzed.
Thank you, Francesca, for that wonderful presentation, but sad history. And like Gabor said, earlier, we seem to think, or we are made to believe, that everything started on October the 7th. But thank you. I have a really wonderful video, but I'm not going to play it right now, that will try and explain some of how Israelis can live so easily with the occupation, by a wonderful journalist by the name of Gideon Levy. But I will not play that. We'll see how the time goes.
Prakash,
panelists, yes,
Prakash,
sir.
Let me
Yes,
make a point. You mentioned Gideon
please.
Levy. Gideon Levy had an article 2 days ago called "Why I'm Ashamed to Be." He says, in Israel, 20,000 Gazans are responsible for their own deaths. I've never been so ashamed. This is Gideon Levy.
Yeah.
He's received hundreds and maybe even thousands of attacks and death threats. So that this phenomena of critics of Israel being maligned and slandered and threatened doesn't just happen in the West. It even happens to Israelis who speak out. I just wanted to make that point.
No, thank you. And anybody else, please, panelists, feel, Gabor, you just made up my mind. I'm going to play this video, and if necessary, we'll go slightly beyond 1:30 of those who are available. But I'm going to try and play this if I can find it. Give me one sec. He makes three really good points, but I think it is worth listening to.
We can also share it
Sure.
afterwards.
The Israeli society had surrounded itself with shields, with walls, not only physical walls, but also mental walls. I don't want to get into it because it's another lecture, but I'll just give the three principles which enable us Israelis to live so easily with this brutal reality. A, most of the Israelis, if not all of them, deeply believe that we are the chosen people. And if we are the chosen people, we have the right to do whatever we want. B, there were more brutal occupations in history. There were even longer occupations in history, even though the Israeli occupation gets to quite a nice record. But there was never in history an occupation in which the occupier presented himself as the victim. Not only the victim, the only victim around. This also enables any Israeli to live in peace because we are the victims. The other day, Professor Falk spoke about this dual strategy of Israel of being a victim on one hand and manipulating the other on the other hand. After what happened in Paris and in Copenhagen with the terror attacks, Benjamin Netanyahu came with the notion all the Jews must come to Israel. It's the safest place for the Jews in the world. It's a shelter for the Jews in the world. Which is wrong, because Israel is today the most dangerous place on earth for Jews, but let's put it aside. It was only 24 hours later when he said Israel is an existential threat under the Iranian bomb. And I asked myself, how can you dare call Jews to come and to join this suicidal project when the Iranians are going to bomb us? But in Israel, everything goes, and both declarations were accepted as the only truth. And here I get to the third set of values which enable us Israelis to live in peace with the occupation. And this is maybe the most crucial one and the worst one. We say victimization, we say chosen people. When I say victimization, it goes without saying we have to mention the Holocaust and the unforgettable Mrs. Golda Meir that the American jury had exported to Israel. She said once, this unforgettable woman, that after the Holocaust, the Jews have the right to do whatever they want. But the third set of values is the most dangerous one, and this is the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinians, which enable us Israelis to live in peace with everything, because if they are not human beings like us, then there is not really a question of human rights. And if you scratch under the skin of almost every Israeli, you will find it there. Almost no one will treat the Palestinians as equal human beings like us. I once wrote that we treat the Palestinians like animals, and I got so many protest letters from animal rights organizations. Rightly so. But by the end of the day, how many Israelis did ever try for a moment to put themselves in the place of the Palestinians for a moment, for one day? And I want to give you two examples which will demonstrate it. Many years ago, I interviewed then candidate for Prime Minister, Ehud Barak. And I asked him a question which I try to ask in any occasion. Mr. Barak, what would have happened if you would have been born Palestinian? And Barak gave me then the only honest answer he could give me. He said I would have joined a terror organization.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there and I'll post it. But I thought it was apropos. Thank you so much, Francesca, again. I'm going to call on Kayum. Kayum, can you put on your camera and come? There you are, my friend. So, Kayum, can you help us walk through, I want you to try and give us a little bit of a critique of the international law and human rights, and tell us from a different perspective, what are the shortcomings? What are the failures, if any? At least that's the first thing I want to do. And then if you've got the time, I'll talk maybe about the apartheid in South Africa and in Palestine as well.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much for inviting me to this very illustrious panel. It's incredibly hard to follow Gabor and Francesca's profoundly insightful and moving reflections. But perhaps I want to pick up on 2 points Gabor made around academic institutions and academic freedom, and Francesca's last point about the paralysis of the international community. And I recognize that a large number of our audience, as I understand it, are primarily lawyers and legal scholars. And so I will take up your offer of providing some critiques of the international legal framework, but doing so in a way that draws very much on Palestinian scholars, activists, and poets. So I teach at Columbia University School of Public Health here in Manhattan, in New York, whose mission is explicitly focused on the idea that health is a human right. But when I teach my course on health and human rights advocacy, I do so on land that's been appropriated through a genocidal erasure of indigenous Lenape people, in a building named after a multi-millionaire pharmaceutical company CEO, in a classroom named after a bank implicated in the 2008 financial crisis. And so, of course, for me, what does it mean to teach human rights in spaces that glorify wealth and capitalism, in spaces rooted in this colonial history? And just yesterday, I received a complaint from a colleague about a class I taught on Palestine 3 months ago, which is now being criticized for failing to fully present Israeli perspectives. And so Gabor's point around academic freedom and academic institutions as spaces that are meant to be spaces of intellectual freedom and academic freedom are certainly being shut down in spaces such as the United States. But I also want to pick up on Francesca's point about the paralysis of the international community. And I want to do so by reflecting on the now famous poem by Rifat al-Arir, a Palestinian poet who was killed in an Israeli airstrike 2 weeks ago. I want to perhaps examine the international legal framework through the lens of Rifat's poem. And Rifat starts his poem with, "If I must die, you must live to tell my story," he says. And then he ends the poem with, "If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale." The poem's title, If I Must Die, seems to suggest Rifat al-Arir's recognition that he lives in a world where life has essentially been reduced to the anticipation of death. He recognizes that the authority to determine who lives and who must die is managed by forces over which he has no control. And so through his poem, Rifat unveils the flawed logic of several widely held assumptions, including that the Israeli occupation is temporary, that the quote-unquote peace process will soon bring an end to Israeli abuses, that Palestinians have meaningful control over their lives in the West Bank and in Gaza. And these assumptions, I argue, have obscured the reality of Israel's entrenched discriminatory rule over Palestinians, which amount to the crime of apartheid, and which is recognized as a crime against humanity. As a South African, and Prakash, you have far more experience as this, experiencing apartheid, at least for me, for the first 18 years of my life. I know what apartheid looks like, what it feels like, and how it facilitates what Frantz Fanon describes as a neurotic orientation. I traveled a few months ago to Palestine, where I taught a class on social medicine at Birzeit University. And I observed again firsthand what can only be described as the metastasization of apartheid. And so, despite numerous UN resolutions calling for an end to Israeli occupation, despite reports from human rights organizations documenting Israeli violations of international law, at the end of the day, Palestinian poet Rifat al-Arir must die. And so this leads me to offer some provocations for debate and discussion about the limitations of international law, particularly, as Francesca mentioned, we're celebrating 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this month. And so first, I think it's important to note that in the same year that the Universal Declaration was adopted in 1948, the State of Israel was also created, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homes and lands during the Nakba, or the catastrophe. So as we celebrate 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how do we simultaneously make sense of the failure of the human rights framework to ensure Palestinian liberation? How do we respond to Palestinian scholar Danya Keito's assertion that while cataloging human rights violations is critical as matters of record and tools for advocacy, they do little, she argues, to end such violations? And how do we respond to Palestinian human rights lawyer Rabia Edbaria's claim that legal scholars tend to sharpen their pens after the smell of death has dissipated and moral clarity is no longer urgent? And so while I agree with my esteemed colleagues that human rights and international law can reduce violent conflict, the international peace and security framework seems wholly inadequate to respond to what's unfolding in Palestine. At a conceptual level, I believe that part of the problem is that we often define peace in terms of violence, whether it's positive peace, which is defined as the absence of structural violence, or negative peace, which refers to the absence of physical violence. The language of peace has essentially become a framework for determining how much violence is permissible. And so I'd like to conclude my opening thoughts by proposing that we need a new vocabulary, a new framework, a new grammar of resistance that can bring an end to the occupation and an end to this paralysis that Francesca so carefully and clearly articulated. And I think we have an obligation to respond to Palestinian poet Rifat al-Arir, who demands that his death should become a tale of hope. And this responsibility, I believe, requires our collective imagination and courage to advance systems of knowledge that essentially and fundamentally center Palestinian voices.
Thank you, Kayum. We will not touch on apartheid. I think it's a given. Everybody has touched on it already. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Mante.
Thank you for all of these insightful points. We've talked about I think the collective failure of international law, or the double standard in which we apply international law, and how unresponsive international institutions have been to what's going on in Palestine. Ketty, as the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, you have, and the organization has been very vocal about the indiscriminate attacks on civilian people and infrastructure. And earlier this month, Amnesty issued a report claiming that US joint direct attack munitions were used by the Israeli military in 2 deadly and unlawful strikes on civilian lives, and found that these airstrikes were either direct attacks on civilians or indiscriminate attacks, which amount to war crimes. And so I was wondering, in the report, Amnesty said, and very clearly, and this is not unusual or novel, that to knowingly assist in violations is contrary to the obligation to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. A state that continues to supply arms being used to commit violations may share responsibility for these violations. Can you first elaborate on this and its implications for not just international law, but also for nation states and international institutions?
Yes, thanks so much, Mante. What a pleasure it is to be with so many of you on this panel, unfortunately under very, very challenging circumstances. Maybe before I answer your question, Mante, I want to piggyback a little bit on what Kayum just said, because I think he made a really important statement on the international human rights framework in the 75th anniversary and where we find ourselves. And I completely agree. We are at, probably at the worst point where we could be 75 years later. I think the way I see it, though, is that it's not human rights that have failed us. It is the international infrastructure meant to implement the human rights framework that has failed. And it's our leadership as well that has failed us profoundly. So I think we have a severe crisis of leadership globally. And we have a UN Security Council which is completely paralyzed and is not adept or able to maintain peace and security. In fact, the 5 states that are sitting on the UN Security Council are the ones who have the greatest ability to harm. And so I just wanted to, just start with that. Yes, we did issue a report on the use of US arms in this war. Before that, we also we reported the use of white phosphorus, which is an extremely dangerous weapon prohibited under the Arms Trade Treaty and international law as well. And unfortunately, not enough has been done in that sense. The report, and perhaps I'll post it after this, I'll post the report to the use of US arms. We have not yet documented the use of Canadian arms, but it is one of our core calls right now is to ensure that there's a full arms embargo towards Israel, as we're not able to prove that any of those weapons are not right now unlawfully indiscriminating Palestinian residents in Gaza. So that's extremely concerning. In the 2 strikes that we verified, at least 43 civilians were killed as part of those strikes that we were able to again document. And I want to highlight how difficult it is right now for us to do our work. It's extremely difficult. We use a crisis evidence lab to re-monitor and ensure that the information we provide is accurate, but it's extremely challenging to do so right now. And so coming back to the comment you made, states have an obligation not just to protect human rights, but also to not refrain the enjoyment of human rights by others. And so in this case, with the US, definitely we have evidence that US weapons have been used, but potentially also Canadian weapons. I think this is an important advocacy call for everybody who's in Canada to ensure that Canada is not only not complicit, not only not responding, but also that Canadian weapons are not endangering or killing civilians in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. So that's a really critical point. The other thing that I wanted to talk about really briefly, there are 2 other things that I wanted to talk about. I won't touch on the apartheid piece. It's been talked about, but we've published a very extensive report on the use of apartheid last year. 2 things. One, Francesca has talked about briefly, and it's the situation in the West Bank. So while the eyes of the world right now are focused on Gaza, in the West Bank, what we've also been documented is a very concerning and worrying rise of detention of Palestinians in Israeli jails right now. We've seen, so since 1967, the Israeli authorities have made wide use of administrative detention to imprison thousands of Palestinians, including children, without any charge. But since October 7th, we're seeing that number rise at extreme levels. So over 2,200, bearing in mind that every number that we give right now is subject to review because nobody has the full accurate numbers at this moment. But over 2,200 Palestinians have been detained, held under administrative detention, and the number is only rising. So it doubled in the first month of October. And we've also documented torture, ill treatment of these detainees. We're seeing them being severely beaten, humiliated, many of them forced to sing Israeli songs while they are in jails, and sometimes wearing the apparel of Israeli soldiers as well. And we've seen women as well degraded, humiliated in appalling ways. So that is also a situation that we need to not forget about and continue to keep up, not only our eyes on, but continue to call for the end of this mistreatment and administrative detention. And the other thing that I wanted to raise is the impact here in Canada. And so particularly when it comes to the right to peaceful assembly and public assembly. This is a right that is vital for political participation. And states have a legal obligation to protect and to facilitate everybody's right to freedom of expression. And now to restrictions which cause a very chilling effect needs to meet the test of legality, of necessity, and proportionality. And so to base restrictions based simply on a message of the assembly. So as we've seen, people gathering to call an end of the violence in Gaza, this is a violation of international law, and particularly singling out specific assemblies because of the identity of the organizer, in this case, Palestinians, could amount to discrimination and racial discrimination as well. So restricting assemblies because they are pro-Palestinian or restricting speech within workplaces as well could amount to, could be argued to be racial discrimination. So we have to be really careful about this. And going back to the point that Dr. Gabor made earlier, not conflate critique of Israel and Israel's policies with anti-Semitism. And this is often the case with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which does just that. So it is fundamental that we ensure that this does not happen. And obviously, and as always, who gets silenced the most? It tends to be Black, racialized, people of Arab origin, indigenous peoples who, when they speak on this issue in particular, tend to be the most impacted, whether it's within the legal profession, but we've seen it in journalism as well. We've seen journalists of color, women of color in particular, being under severe attack publicly because of their stance on this issue. And this also extends beyond and across all sectors. So that, again, is a complete violation of human rights. And Canada has an obligation to ensure that people can express themselves safely and peacefully. So maybe I'll just pause here now, and we may have a round where we speak about what we can do moving forward. There's a lot that I think we can do collectively to not give up and feel a sense of despair, but indeed continue to pressure. And we're seeing already that the Canadian government is beginning to shift its policy slightly, a little bit late, but it gives us hope that more is possible if we're all united and we speak in a powerful voice. At the end of the day, people power is the only thing that will indeed move us forward.
Thank you, Ketty. There was so much that you've addressed, and it's a perfect segue because one of the reasons why we established this panel was to address the fact that many professionals, we were initially focusing on the legal community because of the backlash to lawyers, law students who were speaking out and writing petitions in solidarity with Palestine. They're being silenced in their workplaces and their organizations at large. And like you've mentioned, it's not unique and it's not exceptional to the legal profession. It impacts many other organizations and sectors. And so, Ishat, Reza, you are a human rights and employment lawyer. And, I'd love your perspective on what can people do when they are speaking out in solidarity with Palestinian people, where they wear Palestinian symbols to work, like the kafia. How can they protect themselves on issues like this, while also exactly what Ketty said, these are legal obligations to, which are also related to human rights violations, discrimination. So I'd love for you to weigh in on that.
Okay, well, thank you. I just want to start by acknowledging I'm coming to you from Toronto, which is the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat people, the Haudenosaunee, and I'm grateful to be able to be part of this panel to discuss more from a Canadian perspective what kinds of implications, workplace implications there are to what's happening right now. One of the first things that I want to point out is that as lawyers, since there are a number of people here from the legal profession, it's incumbent on us to be competent in areas that we advise clients. And that competency includes having an understanding of the context. If people are coming to you, employers or even employees, bringing up this issue, about how to deal with it in the workplace, that we need to be informed ourselves on what the historical context is, what the political context is, understanding the situation from objective sources, and not just relying on what you may hear in the media or from one side or another. So that would be one of the first things that I think it's really important for lawyers and employers to make sure that they have an informed perspective, and one that understands both the Palestinian plight and also Israeli perspectives on the issue. What I'm hearing from workplaces is that either there's no political talk allowed in the workplace, and some people like that because then it's a place where you don't come into accusations of this or that or anything heated. But others have stated that in those kinds of workplaces, it's actually very difficult to be in, especially when there's a genocide going on. And we know that not everybody accepts that there's a genocide going on. But if you look at the international definition, or you understand the legal context, it's not a completely improper understanding to say that what is happening right now is a genocide. So that's an objective point. And so what people are dealing with in the workplace are employers or coworkers denying the reality of the situation. A lot of anti-Palestinian racism is coming up in the workplace, and this is something that people need to be aware of. Anti-Palestinian racism is something very distinct to Islamophobia, because Palestinians are made up of Muslims, Christians, maybe people who don't identify with either faith, but there's certain aspects of anti-Palestinian racism. So there's the general kind where you're treated differently because of your Palestinian background. But also things like denial of their existence even as a peoples. Some people will say that Palestinians don't exist, and this sort of comment has happened in the workplace. You're just an Arab. You could just go live in another Arab country. I mean, you guys have so many countries, things like that, like really denying the existence of Palestinians and denying their indigeneity in Palestine, that they don't really have a connection to the land. And denying the Nakba, twisting things like making it that, intifada is something that is threatening to Jews, when a word like intifada, which means uprising, is about Palestinian liberation. Similarly, as we've touched on before, the river to the sea comment, it's about Palestinian liberation. And one thing for people to be aware of is that Palestinians are being held to a higher standard than any other group when it comes to, one person at a protest might say something problematic, and that then gets extended to what everybody else who's there believes or says, whereas that the opposite doesn't happen, right? And so I think we need to be conscious of the fact that there is a very specific anti-Palestinian racism that is being expressed in this country, certainly in workplaces. And workplaces have an obligation to make sure that the workplace is safe for all of their employees. Now, getting into the topic of, well, does that mean that if you're an ally to Palestinians, and if you're a Palestinian yourself, can you show up to work wearing a keffiyeh? Well, it's gonna depend. In part, every workplace has a right to have a dress code. If there is a policy in the workplace that says, you need to keep politics out of the workplace, well, then probably in that workplace, you don't have that right. But what you need to look at is that being implemented in a fair and equitable manner, meaning is the keffiyeh, unwelcome in the workplace, but so is a flag from another country, or a ring, that is a symbol of another national origin. And if that's not what's happening, if certain speech is okay, and certain point of views are okay politically to be expressed in the workplace, but a pro-Palestinian stance isn't, then that would be discriminatory, and they don't have a right to implement policies in a discriminatory manner. So that's something to keep in mind is, you do have that protection, but every workplace is going to have a social media policy or an off-duty policy to look at, because of course the workplace, the employer can regulate a lot of things in the workspace, but your off-duty conduct is really where it gets a bit more dicey, in the sense that some employers think that just because you've participated in a protest, that gives them the right to discipline you in some way, but it doesn't, as long as it doesn't have a negative impact on your workplace. So that means as long as your conduct outside of work doesn't impact or doesn't hurt the reputation of your company. So if you're just out on the street and you don't have anything on you as related to your work, or you're not identifying yourself as part of this workplace, then the connection between what you're doing there and your workplace is very minimal. But if you go and do some criminal activity, such as spray painting a building, or even a sit-in, for example, in private property is technically, it can be considered trespass. And so if you get removed from that, if you get arrested from that, your workplace might have a reason to talk to you about it, but it really is going to also depend on them being able to establish that somehow has impacted their workplace, that it brings their work, their company into disrepute. So it's not an absolute right for an employer to govern your activities, but it does depend on what kind of impact it has. So that's something, it's always going to be fact specific. And people should just know that provincially, almost every province has political belief or some form of it protected under their human rights legislation. However, there are some notable exceptions, Alberta being one of them, Ontario being another, and Saskatchewan. Nunavut is another one too. So in these other provinces where political belief isn't protected, then you do need to be a bit more careful in terms of your activities and how they may link in with your work. Although there are ways in which arguments can be made legally to say that, well, maybe it's your national origin that's an attack, or it's your race or your religion, or even creed. Now, these things haven't fully been tested in this context in court yet, but it's just something to keep in mind, that you may be protected, but it's always best to read up on the company policies to see what's allowed, what's not allowed, and make sure that the employer is applying their policies in a fair and equitable manner and not in a discriminatory manner. If you find yourself in a situation where you feel there is discrimination, or you think your employer is being unfair, the best course of action really is to seek legal counsel. I do want to mention that there's a legal center for Palestine that has set up a legal referral service. So that's the Legal Center for Palestine. And the website is palestinelegalreferral.ca. And they have lawyers there pro bono and also at cost to help with people navigate any legal issues that you're facing. Lawyers such as myself and Emran, we also run practices where we can do consultations with people. You can reach me at workplacelp.com, and I'll let Emran provide his way of being contacted. So it really is best to get advice if you're dealing with a specific situation, because it is going to be fact specific. But just wanted to make the point that your workplace does have a right to police or restrict your activities, especially at work, but not in a discriminatory fashion. I will leave the freedom of expression to my colleague to bring up, because we do have freedom of expression in Canada, but just so you know, it only applies to the public entities, so the government, the public service, and so on. Your freedom of expression doesn't come into play in the workplace unless you work for a public entity. So that's why the human rights legislation is really the one that would apply in your case. So I'll wrap up my comments for now for that, and I'm happy to answer anything further.
Thank you, Ishat. I know, Francesca, that you have to leave, but something that really struck me in an interview that you recently did, you described yourself as sensitive when it comes to, the criticism of being called anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas or pro-terrorist. And I really can empathize with that significantly. You are in an international role. You are very public facing. I was wondering, because there are many people who have written to us to share how they feel silenced in their organizations, if you can share with us how you navigate that, especially given the role that you play as the UN Special Rapporteur.
Yeah, look, I was somewhat prepared to some of the venom, in a way, that would be directed at me, because my predecessors have experienced a lot of this as well. But there are two things that have been new to me. And the first is that, of course, let's say the attacks, the smears have been much more numerous, because I've been more present, for example, on the media, on social media. I'm very active on social media compared to my predecessors, and this has been a factor that has exposed me. The other element that I was not necessarily prepared to is the misogyny. There is a lot of misogyny that underpins. Not only there is the malignity of accusing someone who has devoted her entire life to human rights and justice of something as horrible as anti-Semitism. And again, as an Italian, this has a very deep meaning for me, and it resonates profoundly. It's even so. On the one hand, I would feel personally compelled to react. On the other hand, I don't, because I know that this is used as a way to deflect the attention from where it matters. And so I say, okay, now let's deal with what matters the most. It's not about me as a person, it's about the message that I'm trying to bring forward. The misogynistic part is less easy to deal with, because you can see that sometimes it goes unnoticed. And then it depends on the context, because there are certain contexts which are more developed and more advanced than others. And when I say than others, I refer to my own country, where it's totally normal to insult a woman, also on again, because she's a woman, and again, this is normalized. Again, how do I deal with it? As I said, going back to the core mission, also knowing that I'm a model for many. I have to stand the ground. I have to continue to speak. People say speak truth to power, but in fact, I just try to continue my mission of unveiling facts and the legal qualification. So this is how I go about that. And also thinking of something that Kayum said, thinking of the new grammar, this is time. I agree with him. I agree. I mean, there were so many good inputs that came from the three speakers that followed us. But on this new grammar, there is a need now more than ever to discover the true meaning of solidarity. Like, I often remind people that it becomes from a beautiful Latin word, solidum, which is a sort of togetherness. And this togetherness that is to be rediscovered now. And in this inclusive language, I bring both the Palestinians and the Israelis, because both of them have to be interested by this language of justice, human rights, and solidarity. And I'm afraid that I will have to leave you soon.
Oh, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Francesca.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know
Wait a
we're
minute.
probably.
I'm sorry, Mante.
Yeah, go ahead, Gabor.
Is Kayum still with us, or did he have to leave?
He had to leave.
Okay.
Oh, he's still here. Okay, good. I
Yes.
thought your
I'm
message
sorry.
that you were leaving. Sorry.
Oh, great. Can I put a question to him?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Kayum, you talked about the paralysis of the international community. I don't see paralysis. I see active complicity. I wonder if you'd comment. They're not paralyzed. They're acting, you know.
That's such a good point. Maybe I was being a little too generous to the international community, sort of referencing what Francesca was saying. But I completely agree with you. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I spoke at the UN at the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a week before that, the Security Council had adopted a resolution calling for these humanitarian pauses. And it became apparent to me in that moment that there was a deliberate attempt to use these pauses again as a way of managing death. And so fully agree that the failure of the international community signals that we require a radical shift away from the current structures that organize international human rights law and humanitarian law frameworks, as Ketty mentioned, I think quite clearly and articulately, that we have to think through ways of engaging questions of peace and security, which seem to be inherently rooted in a form of coloniality that centers Euro-American ideas and knowledge systems. And I think it's important to begin to decenter those systems and center the voices of those who are actually on the margins and the receiving end of these policies. So fundamentally agree with you, Gabor. And it's been, I think, an absolute privilege just to hear all of you speak and engage on these issues. I think I leave this conversation feeling very enriched and energized to continue the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Thank you.
Just one quick point, and thank you. I feel the same way. It can feel so isolating and disheartening, and so it's always good to be in contact with people who share the humanity. About the colonial mentality that you mentioned, our Prime Minister Trudeau said that we support Israel, Canada, because we share the same values. And you know what? It's true. Both countries were founded in colonialism and the suppression of the indigenous people. And that continues in Canada even till today. Not in the same horrendous fashion anymore, but yeah, unfortunately, we do share the same values. And so it's a struggle not just for justice, but against decolonizing our own mentality.
I was wondering if I could jump in, Mante, just to say that I know some of the questions that came in, people were asking about, well, what do we do? How do we not get labeled a certain way for our pro-Palestinian stances? And something to keep in mind is that there are a lot of really good objective sources out there. So as Ketty had mentioned, Amnesty International has done some very good work around apartheid and other things connected to the issue, as have different UN organizations. There are a lot of academics out there. So I would encourage people to look for these resources, and there may be places where they're collated and so on, so that if people are making accusations based on basically intellectual dishonesty, that you do have a means to point back at them and say, well, actually, if you look at the sources, that's not right, and not feel free to call something out as propaganda if that's what it is.
Thank you. And on the decolonial perspective, something that really resonates with me is the massive silence within organizations, as we've talked about, because most people who tend to speak out on these issues, as Ketty, you've identified, are Indigenous, Black, or of other racialized identities. And their leaders, we've seen with Claudine Gay, we've seen with the president of Harvard, we've seen that with Sarah Jama, who is a Black disabled Muslim MPP, who early on called for a ceasefire and was expelled from caucus. And now our federal government is calling for a ceasefire. So we see Black and brown folks being really silenced. What advice would you offer organizations who, champion diversity, equality, and inclusion, but then at the same time, many of their people feel silenced? What advice would you give to them? Not everybody at once.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering who's the question to.
It's for the panel.
For the panel. Well, I'll start quickly. I mean, I would say that, employers do have an obligation to make sure that their workplace is safe for everyone within it. I did have someone tell me that there's a lot of anti-Palestinian racism in her workplace, and coming from people in positions of power in the organization. And that's unacceptable. If you're engaging in a way in the workplace that is making certain employees feel attacked or uncomfortable in that manner, it needs to not happen, because that can lead to a toxic work environment. It can have implications, legal implications, such as constructive dismissal, et cetera. So, it's important for employers to make sure they have a harassment-free workplace, that it's a safe workplace for their employees. So to make sure that they're informed. I mean, to me, that I think that's, it's knowledge is necessary in order to effectively run any kind of an organization, and recognizing that right now it's a very difficult time for everybody, and more so for some people and others, and to realize that it's not just one narrative, that there are different perspectives, there is a long history, and that unless you yourself are informed about that history, you're not going to be capable of dealing with this issue. And if you're not informed, then get a way to get yourself informed on the issues.
Thank you, Ishat.
I agree with Gabor. It's quite, sometimes you can discuss and debate with people who have an open mind and an open heart, but unfortunately not many do on this particular issue. They are so emotionally tied. They don't want to understand the facts. They don't want to understand the history. For those people, I don't waste time, because you'll never get through to them. The last point that Francesca made, I think, was a really important one, of solidarity, and I think Ketty as well. In our own experience in South Africa, we struggle internally for a long, long time for our freedom. But it was the solidarity of the international community that helped us push us over the line. And I think that we are at the beginning stages of people recognizing what's happened in Palestine for so many decades, and are now beginning to stand up and be counted. What is encouraging is there are many Jewish scholars, writers, activists who are joining the fight for justice. And I think this momentum, each one of us can build on. We have to work in a community to build this solidarity, because governments are not going to move on their own. The Canadian government was not going to move on its own. It's the people. In South Africa, we had the United Kingdom, we had Germany, and the Americans supporting apartheid to the hilt. But they had to change that. And the only reason they had to change that is because of the people. The people on the ground stood together and campaigned and called for the boycott of South Africa, sanctions, isolate South Africa. And I think, the time has come where we can't go back on the issue of Palestine. So there is hope. And I think each one of us can make a difference, but collectively, I think we can make a big difference.
I couldn't agree more, Prakash. And, Jessica, you and I have been friends since law school, where you were really vocal in our international humanitarian law class, speaking out and challenging these issues. You are very vocal as a Jewish woman. You say that you get a lot of support and solidarity when you attend Palestinian marches. And I was wondering what you can share for people like us, everyday civilians, people part of the civil society, what we can do to address these injustices.
I would say that we have to don't underestimate the power of civil discourse with somebody. The power of, even if they're shutting down, even if somebody's labeling someone else anti-Semitic, by saying someone is anti-Semitic, I think John Stewart said it best. He said it immediately shuts down the conversation. And I think it's incumbent upon us to encourage an open dialogue. And that if that means hearing somebody out, even though you may completely disagree with them, then hear them out. Because I had the opportunity of living in Gaza several years ago, but while I was a law student, and coming out of Gaza and speaking to anyone and everybody about what I experienced, but also hearing them out, hearing Israelis out. And, that wasn't an easy thing to do. My dad's cousin was actually part of the military and walked the border between Israel and Egypt. And for him to hear what I was saying about the experiences that I witnessed, the examples of collective punishment in Gaza, being able to go to Rafah and see 2,000 homes in front of me, mosques and schools demolished, seeing that he wasn't aware of, he didn't know about. So being able to give those examples of what is happening on the ground, the collective punishment on a massive scale, the trying to silence and stamp out any opposition to Palestinians pushing back, it's incumbent upon us to really encourage a discourse. And if that means not talking about, not using the word genocide, then don't use the word genocide. Use the facts on the ground instead. They don't have to agree with the word genocide, but you can use the facts on the ground to make your point. And that will open up their minds to that. And eventually they will come around and realize it is a genocide, what's happening. So to me, it's all about encouraging conversation and open dialogue.
Thank you, Jessica.
Imran, you have anything to add, my friend?
I guess the only thing I'll add, and everyone says such excellent things, I don't want to keep anyone here too long, but just on the topic of freedom of expression, Prakash, because I agree with you. I think that's ultimately what changes governments' positions at the UN and changes their stances on voting, right? And I think this situation is a little bit unique because unlike most circumstances in history where we're dealing with government infringement, we're kind of dealing with employment infringement. But one of the few places where we can rely on the charter is at universities. So we've seen a lot of backlash with students or teachers even who are putting out pro-Palestinian statements and then they're being punished for that. So we saw, for example, Dr. Guy, who's a fourth-year physician at the University of Ottawa, and he put out some pro-Palestinian statements, and he was lambasted as being anti-Semitic and then suspended. But the charter can apply in education circumstances. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that it's not very clear when the government is when the courts are trying to figure out whether or not the charter is engaged. They'll tend to look at a three-part test. The first is whether the government entity or the non-government entity is controlled by the government. The second is whether it's exercising delegated statutory authority. And the third is whether it's implementing specific government policies, programs, and objectives. And over the past 20 years or so, there's been a bit of a divide across the country. So in Alberta, the courts have recognized that universities, when they're engaging with freedom of expression, they are engaging with the charter. And in Ontario and BC, that hasn't been the case. And I think that's because most of the time the appellate courts in Ontario and BC are ignoring that third branch, whether or not specific government policies, programs, or objectives are being engaged. And I think Dr. Guy's case is going to provide a very interesting, it was going to be an interesting moment for us because unlike in the past, in the most recent case in Ontario was an Ontario Court of Appeal case back from 2012, unlike in the past in Ontario, for the first time, I think you can say that there is a government policy or program that's being implemented, because in 2019, the Ford government, passed a new policy that required all universities to implement the Chicago Principles of Free Speech and to report to the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario. And the government said that, listen, if you don't comply with the principles of free speech, we'll pull back on your funding. And I think that now, if Dr. Gay's case, for example, it ends up being subject to judicial review or ends up hitting up the higher appellate courts, I think it's going to be very difficult for courts in Ontario to ignore that third branch. So all that to say is that I think when we're looking at freedom of expression, I think students at the post-secondary institutions, they play some of the biggest roles in kind of funneling a new movement and standing up for the Palestinian people like we've seen, and that's why they've come under so much criticism and attack in the States. I think most of those students can rest assured, at least in Ontario and Alberta, that most likely that speech is protected, but I'd still caution them not to go overboard, which kind of goes along with that pragmatic common sense approach that Ishat was advocating for.
Thank you, Imran.
Thank you.
Ketty, you wanted to say something?
Yes, really quickly. First, on the initial comment on diversity, I just, I always say that everybody loves diversity until diversity has a diverse opinion, and then suddenly, everything changes. A reminder also to employers that this is a time where to support your Palestinian or Jewish or Israeli employees as well, and not assume that they are well. I think this is a time to provide mental health support as much as possible, time off, and to check in on your staff as well. Going back to the keyword of solidarity, today is actually December 18th, is actually International Day of Action for solidarity with Gaza. And so if you are in Ottawa on Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, I'd like to invite you to join us at the Monument of Human Rights at 4:30. We will have a vigil there in solidarity with all the victims of this atrocious war, and also to call more and more on the Canadian government to speak powerfully and strongly on the need for a ceasefire. We cannot leave that burden to Palestinians alone. It has to be all of us, each one of us taking action together. And so please join us at 4:30. We'll be there for about an hour, and follow us as well for more actions in the days to come.
Thank you. Thank you. Gabor, if I could ask you very briefly, my friend, there are a lot who are present today have fear and anxiety because of what's happening and what they say or what they could land up. Do you have any advice how they could, handle their own situation of fear and anxiety in these difficult times?
Well, every person is different and their situation is different. Some people might be really facing jeopardy if they speak out on this issue. They might, given the climate in Canada, given the atmosphere of intimidation. As I said earlier, nobody is going to lose a job if they speak out in favor of killing 20,000 Palestinians. But you could be facing professional liabilities if you speak out against it. And that reflects power, it reflects control, it reflects also the effectiveness and the compliance of Canadian media and governments with the Israeli project. So you need to handle that judiciously. You need to decide, if I speak out, what price might have to pay, and am I willing to pay it? So that's just a legitimate fear. Anxiety is something else. Anxiety is a non-specific fear. And I find that the source of anxiety are rarely in the present situation. It's more like stuff that's being stirred up from the past. For example, if you're not facing specific jeopardy before speaking out, but you're anxious about it, then what is that all about? Well, I would ask you, how did you grow up in your family of origin? Could you express yourself? Could you be authentic? What did you face if you were authentic? Did you face rejection or criticism or disapproval or withdrawal of love? Because anxiety, that's what the source of anxiety are. So just to make this very quick, fear can be very specific to a present situation. You need to decide how much legitimate concern you have and how they want to handle that. Easy for me, because they can't fire me because I don't have a job, you know. But if I did, I might be, you know, okay, so some invitations might be canceled, such as I mentioned at a major Canadian university. I'm happy to handle that. I made a decision a long time ago that there's nothing in me allows me not to speak out on this. But other people might definitely face sanctions. They have to make this decision. Is it worth to me to speak out? It's not a question of anxiety, it's a specific fear. If you have anxiety, which is more nebulous and more deep-rooted, I'd suggest you look for the sources of that in your own history and reach out for help. You're not alone. And as somebody said earlier on this talk, that just joining others and having your point of view validated will go a long way towards alleviating or minimizing any negative, fearful feelings that you might have. So that's what I would say, Prakash.
Thank you, Gabor. And that's one of the main reasons Mante and I decided to have this forum, so that people know they're not alone. And, hopefully we can remain in touch with all our participants going forward as well. Mante, over to you.
Yeah, I know we're out of time and we're on the hour. So I just, if you don't have anything else to say, Prakash, I can close the session. I really am, we're both very grateful for you being able to speak today. Me personally, I found that incredibly informative. You've all shared your unique expertise on these issues. And I think it's been really informative to give not just direction and advice, especially on navigating workplace issues, but also on how we can, as individuals, really come together and advance justice for all, for all of us in our society. So I'm really grateful for that. I do want to acknowledge we didn't have a Palestinian panelist today. We were here today to speak as allies, people who came together to discuss our concern for the human rights condition in Palestine and its impact on the Palestinian population. We also recognize that Palestinian people are not a monolith. They exist at the intersection of religion, disability, gender, identity, and religion. And so they are not just Muslim, but as Ishat had said, and we've always said, they are Christian. They may not be of any religious identity. And we really are here not to denounce people, but to speak out for truth and justice for all. And I think everyone has expressed that beautifully today. And I just encourage us to continue these discussions and to approach them with humility, with curiosity, with empathy and compassion. We are all humans, and I think we're all struggling with what is going on in Palestine today. And we should offer one another grace, no matter what side we're taking on these issues. And with that, I just want to again express my profound gratitude to each and every one of you for being here today.
I echo that completely.
Thank
I know
you.
how busy everyone is, and Gabor, I will be in touch with you, my friend. Thank you again. Thank you, Ketty.
Thank you.
Everybody else, Ishat, Imran, Jessica, and of course, Francesca and Kayum as well. Thank you all.
Thank you.